So a very, very good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Solihull Christadelphian Hall. We welcome all those joining us on Zoom as well. Just to say that for CSN, this is another experiment running a in-hall experience for those of you that can be here, but also bringing in those who would rather watch from the comfort of their homes. For those of you I don't know, my name's Gordon Dawes, but my role in CSN is to coordinate and dragoon and manage and coordinate the committee. So I don't suppose I need to say very much about the importance of the neurodiversity topic, except to remind you that we are all part of the neurodiverse. We're all in it. We are physically different, we are spiritually different, we are mentally and emotionally different, and how we each receive and sense and process information is a very personal matter. It's important that as individuals, as teams, as ecclesias, as a Christadelphian community, we really understand that, and we do our very best as a community to ensure that we make everyone feel welcome, understood, and supported as individuals, as families, as a group together. That's what Jesus would do, and that's what we are going to do. And we're very, very pleased and grateful to have Sister Becky Lewis from the King's Heath Ecclesia with us today. She has significant lived experience of what we're going to talk about. She'll tell you more about that herself. So it gives me great pleasure to step down and let this young lady in. Notice I said young. Okay, to look after the rest of the morning.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you all here. So, this is our programme for the morning. So we're just having a quick introductory session first about the general topic of neurodiversity, and then a short break before we then move on to dyslexia.
So, these sessions aim to do two things: introduce you to neurodiversity and its potential impacts on faith and church life, and show you what a neuro-friendly environment might look like. So that's why we've got activities at the back, we've got fidgets dotted around the place, we've got a quiet room, which unfortunately you have to pass by me to escape to, which isn't ideal, but you will be very welcome to go there whenever you want. That's a key thing with neurodivergent people, is they like to know there is an opportunity to escape for some quiet if they need it. So that is your place today, and that is there all day for whenever you want to use it. So please feel free to move about as much as you want to. Today is just a basic overview of neurodiversity. It does not give you enough information to diagnose yourself or someone else. So please be very careful. If there's someone you suspect might be neurodivergent, please be very careful about approaching that topic with them. And our aim is to be as neuro-affirming as we can, but there are variations on what terms people prefer. So I do apologise in advance if I use terms that you don't feel comfortable with. Things are changing all the time with this topic, so it is hard to keep up sometimes. So, why am I leading these sessions?
So I am a music teacher by profession. I've been teaching for about 25 years. I've had a lot of neurodivergent pupils during that time. I've taught SEN classes as well as just general classroom teaching. So I've had the usual teacher training that you get on SEN, which is variable. Some of it good, some of it not so good. But mainly it's my lived experience, I think, that is why I'm here today. So I am very convinced that my dad was ADHD and autistic. And so I've grown up in a household with a neurodivergent person. Not surprisingly, I married someone who reminded me of my dad. So he turned out to be ADHD, autistic, dyslexic and dyspraxic. And then inevitably we ended up with neurodivergent children. So all three of our children have diagnoses. Two of them have both ADHD and autism, and one of them is ADHD. And then, perhaps not surprisingly, as I was taking my children through the diagnostic process, I started to realise that perhaps I might be neurodivergent as well. So looking at some of the features that traits that I had growing up and still have, see if you can try and diagnose me. Sensitive to noise, texture, light, taste, temperature, smell. Hate being splashed, people fiddling with my stuff, having my personal space invaded, being interrupted in a task, anxious about germs, perfectionist, pedant, tummy aches, digestive issues, and struggling with social cues, small talk, and making phone calls. Perhaps it's not a surprise that 8 days ago, I received my diagnosis of autism. So why are we here today? I don't really need to tell you this because you're here, but inclusion is an essential part of being a church. It isn't enough to offer what suits the majority. The shepherd left the 99 to save the one sheep. And pushing together a couple of quotes from Romans 14 and 15. Never put a stumbling block or obstacle in the way of your brother or sister. So welcome each other in the same way that Christ also welcomed you for God's glory. I'm not going to be able to talk much more about inclusion right now, but if you're interested, there is an article which I wrote a few years ago all about it. We can't give the right support if we don't understand, and this is really important. We can try, and sometimes it's a bit hit and miss. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. The more we understand, the better we can support each other. And small things can have a big impact, whether that's good or bad. So what is neurodiversity? Gordon alluded to this in his introduction, that actually the term neurodiversity incorporates everybody.
So, for a group to be neurodiverse, it needs to include people of a mixture of neurotypes, and that could include neurotypical people. Neurotypical people are the majority. Most people are neurotypical. So, because of this, society is set up to suit this way of thinking. So, modern life, tends to suit neurotypical people more than the rest of us. 1 in 7 of us are neurodivergent. That's the current figures anyway. It mainly includes innate conditions, inherited conditions, such as autism and dyslexia. But some people also like to include in this acquired conditions, such as from a stroke or from brain injury. So 1 in 7 of us are neurodivergent. But it can overlap with other conditions as well. So it's very common for neurodivergent people to have physical conditions. We're just starting to link these things together, the physical conditions with the neurodivergence. But that's not something I've really got time to talk about today. So I'm going to focus on 3 neurodivergent conditions, which are dyslexia, ADHD, and autism. Because my experience, my professional experience and my lived experience is mostly to do with people with lower support needs rather than people with higher support needs, that's where I'm going to be focusing today. But I don't want you to feel I'm ignoring that there are neurodivergent people with high additional needs as well, and I just wanted to flag that up. Generally speaking, neurodivergent conditions are what's known as fluctuating disabilities, which means that our ability to cope varies a lot from day to day or even from hour to hour. So the idea that we can assign a level to someone's disability is not really practical. The level of support we need can vary quite a lot in our lifetimes. So
this is a bit of a controversial statement because I know there's an ongoing debate here. Is neurodivergence a disability or a superpower? Being neurodivergent can be both debilitating and enriching, perhaps even in the same hour. So a lot of work is being done to reframe neurodivergence in a positive way, because the medical diagnostic process focuses on what we can't do. And we're trying to now sort of balance that out with the wonderful skills and gifts that come with neurodivergence. But we have to be careful not to underplay the disability level, really, because it is difficult for some people day to day. And I don't want to underplay that or minimise that in any way. To tell people that, hey, don't forget, it's a superpower. When they've struggled to get up in the morning and get dressed, can be quite grating. So I just thought I'd mention that, really. So some statistics then. I've come up with these statistics based on the current figures for the population in the UK. It's not that anybody's done some research in churches per se, but it's just I've extrapolated these figures, and this is as a minimum. In a church of 50 adults, you probably have at least 7 neurodivergent members. I would say actually the number's a lot higher than that, because there are so many undiagnosed people. But as a minimum, you're likely to have 5 people with dyslexia, 1 or 2 with ADHD, and 1 or 2 autistic. In a 2024 study, it was found that out of the children with attendance problems due to school distress, 92.1% of them were neurodivergent, with over 80% of those being autistic. So you can see how neurodivergence has a massive impact on children's ability to even attend school, let alone thrive in school. And if that's the case with children in school, then I would say it's highly likely it's the case for children and adults in church as well. Children with ADHD receive, on average, 20,000 more negative messages about their behaviour by age 12. So if you imagine an adult with perhaps undiagnosed ADHD, the self-confidence is going to be lacking inevitably from all those negative messages they've received throughout their life. And that is going to have an impact on their mental health, what they feel they can do in life, and how they feel they can contribute to society. So looking at some common neurodivergent traits, obviously we can't say that all neurodivergent people are exactly the same, in the same way we can't say all neurotypical people are exactly the same. But there are some common traits across different conditions. These are the sorts of things you might find. Sensory sensitivity, strong emotions, social anxiety, poor self-organisation, stims, which is where you might sort of clap your hands, flap your hands, hum, or fidgeting, you might bite your fingernails, things like that. Intense focus, even with people with ADHD who are known for not being able to focus, they can actually hyper-focus really well if it's something that is interesting to them and they're in the right zone for it. And variable capacity, which is what I mentioned before. So it is definitely a feature of a neurodivergent condition that some days we can do incredibly well, and other days we can really struggle, and we can't really predict or always work out why that is. So the inevitable consequence of having these traits as part of medical diagnostic criteria is that we start to view those in a negative light, as if they are there's a medical problem or even a moral problem with some of these traits. But of course, there's nothing morally wrong with fidgeting, nothing medically wrong with having sensory sensitivity necessarily. It's more that society has kind of been set up to view it as a negative. If neurodivergent people were in the majority and neurotypical people were the ones being diagnosed, you could come up with a similar list of traits for them. So that's what I did.
Here's some common neurotypical traits. Sensory insensitivity, inconsistent with rules, vague with language, struggling to empathise with neurodivergent folk, and strangely excited by salad and yoghurt. So, as you can see, these are just things that help us identify people. It's the external behaviour that helps us notice that the brain is working differently. So it's not necessarily positive or negative, it's just how we are. So you could imagine a world where neurodivergent people are in the majority and someone is diagnosed with being neurotypical. People might say, oh yes, I'm sorry, we've got a neurotypical diagnosis here. Your child needs to learn not to look people in the eye so much. It's making people uncomfortable. We're worried that your child isn't fidgety enough. They're not moving around enough. They need to try and move around more. They're sitting too still in lessons. It's just the way our culture views things. Is it all an excuse? Are we just saying life's hard for us, therefore we don't need to develop any skills, we can just get away with doing less in church? Of course not. I'm not going to go into some of the physical differences today that we have, talking about chemicals and hormones, synaptic pruning, all that sort of stuff. But just basically put, we have a different operating system. The life hacks and tips that tend to help neurotypical people don't tend to help us. Tips like waking up early, using a planner, developing good habits and routines, being consistent, everything in moderation. These things don't tend to stick for us. We might try them for a bit, but then they just fall by the wayside. And we end up feeling like failures because the things that people say are, oh, this will really help you, they don't tend to help. We just need to find different life hacks and different tips. And that's where knowing that you're neurodivergent can really help, because we can find each other and we start to help each other work out what works for us. And once we're able to do that, we're hopefully in a position to feel a little bit more free and a little bit more positive about ourselves, and then to thrive and contribute more. So we've come to our first break, a short break.
And after that, we will be starting to think about dyslexia. I'm hearing a few chuckles already. So in the break, if you like to have something to talk to people about, you like to be given a topic rather than just how are you, where have you come from, you could start thinking about, what does the ideal Christadelphian look like? So this isn't what we logically know is true. We logically know that we're all different and we all need each other to contribute to a vibrant church life. But given our sort of inherent culture, things that you hear from the platform, when you've grown up in Sunday school, what is an ideal Christadelphian good at, and how do they behave? And then we'll be referring back to this at the start of the next session. Okay, welcome back. So why have I asked you to think about the ideal Christadelphian? Let's have a little think about what that might involve. I'm guessing you may have thought of things like someone who is able to study the Bible on their own, probably in a study. Someone who's able to keep up with the readings every day, give talks, teach Sunday school, they have good attendance, and they remember to carry out their rota duties. If they've got family, they sit around and do the readings together every day. So obviously we know that that isn't actually what makes necessarily a good disciple of Christ, but it's kind of a sort of inherited part of our community that we kind of have this idea floating about. So it's kind of an ingrained part of our culture. And thinking about some parts of our culture, our community and the UK education system just happen to have developed around the same sort of time. So they do share similar roots from sort of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a few unconscious patterns and assumptions that I think are relevant here. that we kind of need to look out for. The idea that we're all kind of neutral, empty vessels, we just need to be filled with the right information. So as long as we're there, we're present in the room, or we've read the right book, we've received the information, and we will be able to act on that information. See a few people shaking their heads there. Yeah. Another idea is that reading is always the best way to learn. So before this time, there were older methods of learning, such as kind of absorbing, meditating things, discussing things together. But at this point, books have become more readily available, and almost as a kind of a virtuous attachment to the idea of reading as a spiritual activity in it of itself. And that any difficulties experienced in terms of for school or church are therefore down to personal failings or even moral failings rather than a fault with the system itself. During this time, a great deal of moral weight was placed on things like duty, consistency, reliability, good habits, punctuality. And all of these factors, as we'll see, are bound to have a negative impact when we consider neurodiversity, particularly when combined with the fact that we rely on volunteers for our churches to function. So we don't have paid ministers, and we have good reasons for that. And there are lots of positives from that. But it can add a lot of pressure in terms of requiring our members to be reliable and organised. So that's just something to keep in the back of your minds as we now move on to think about dyslexia. And this perhaps is starting to explain why I've received comments like this in the past. Our youngest son has dyslexia. We are so quick to judge people who don't fit the criteria to be a good brother or sister in Christ. And we'll just have that in the back of our minds as we think through what dyslexia actually is. So it affects at least 1 in 10 people, although I have seen figures that it's more like 1 in 5.
It was discovered nearly 150 years ago, but I still feel there's a lot of ignorance out there about what dyslexia actually is, in spite of the fact that we've known about it for a long time. The main difference is how information is stored and processed in the brain. There's different types of dyslexia. So some people experience what we've got on the screen there, kind of blurring or moving about of letters, issues with vision. Some people have difficulties processing speech, so spoken instructions. If they were to ask someone the way to somewhere, they'd listen to the directions, it just wouldn't go in, or they'd mix up their right and left. But the interesting one that a lot of people don't realise is a dyslexic person could be an excellent public reader. So they can read beautifully, but then they sit down and you say, what was that all about? And they won't have a clue about what they've just read. They're not taking in the information. There's a lot of extra effort involved in reading for dyslexic people. And working memory is often poor as well, so this can make it difficult for dyslexic people to learn something new. It can take a while for things to sink in, and it needs repetition. This is one of the reasons why dyslexic people may find difficulty in reading. It's to do with the fact that they have amazing spatial awareness, so they can flip things round in their head. But that becomes a problem when you're reading letters because, as you can see from this picture, which I'm afraid I don't know the source of, but it's brilliant, because it just goes to show that all of those letters look really similar if you're able to flip things round in your mind. It just makes so much sense as to why there's confusion around writing and reading letters. So, for all the conditions I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to list out some of the strengths and some struggles, because what I've noticed is what a lot of people find difficult is often balanced out with what they excel at, and what they excel at often comes with a negative side as well. And this is certainly the case with dyslexia. So common strengths for dyslexic people are they are creative,
very good at thinking out of the box. They bring in lots of different disciplines together to solve a problem. They don't sort of think through things in a line or necessarily follow logical process. It's more kind of, let's bring everything in to solve this problem. And that's probably partly why 25% of CEOs are dyslexic. Common struggles are arbitrary rules, like this letter has this sound, or learning timetables, learning by rote. That doesn't tend to work for dyslexic people so much. Dyslexic people often have excellent 3D modelling and spatial awareness, so they can make great engineers, good drivers generally. But what they struggle with is a slow processing speed. So they might need more time to absorb ideas, to think around a problem, to answer a question. They might struggle with linear thinking and executive function, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a minute. They often have an excellent vocabulary and are great at leading discussions and telling stories and inspiring people with messages. It's where they struggle is the reading and writing. So that's often a way to spot a dyslexic person, is if they are able to tell a wonderful story, they've got brilliant vocabulary, but they can't then write the story down.
Dyslexics often have great people skills, but that sometimes may be a struggle if they want to talk ideas through or interrupt to ask questions. So it can be quite frustrating if a Sunday school teacher is just trying to get through the lesson and get onto the activity, and the dyslexic person wants to keep asking, what about this? What about that? And that can sometimes get them into trouble. So I got this image on the left from ChatGPT last year. Obviously, I could improve on it now, but I quite like how bad it is. So, executive function is the ability to start a task, pay attention to the task, prioritise what order you're going to do things in, follow multi-step directions, so follow a recipe, for example, manage the time, remember all the details, etc., etc. So there's a lot going on there with executive function, and dyslexic people tend to struggle with this and end up with executive dysfunction, which is the picture on the left, which is they need to do something. It could be something quite straightforward, like have a shower, but all the executives in their head are getting into arguments about what order to do everything in. What do I need to do first? Oh, first I need a towel, but there's no clean towels. And it just spirals, and people can end up getting stuck or just not taking a shower. So if we think about that all throughout life, all the tasks you need to get done during the day, particularly if you need to prepare something, you need to prepare a Sunday school lesson, or you need to prepare a talk, it can just feel really overwhelming. You might end up feeling panicked or anxious or just get stuck. So you might sign up to something. You might say, oh, I'm going to prepare a talk on this date, or I'm going to prepare a Sunday school lesson. And then when you sit down to actually do it, you just can't. And you feel overwhelmed with a sense of panic. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. And you might end up having to ask somebody else to do it for you. So this is a common experience for all neurodivergent people. I'm introducing it here for dyslexia, but it does also apply to ADHD and autistic people as well. So I'm just going to introduce a couple more quotes from people who've had experience of dyslexia in our church. So these are quotes from Christadelphians. I've always considered myself bad for not being able to follow the exhortation or getting lost in public prayer. Where others could openly discuss after Bible class, I could remember snippets. Where others could not only remember most of what was discussed, but also quote scripture in their arguments. If you think about the point about learning things by rote is difficult, so a dyslexic person might struggle with learning the order of the books in the Bible, or remembering a particular Bible passage to look up. They won't remember the reference for it, and they certainly won't be able to quote word for word. I remember I had a dyslexic friend in my Sunday school class growing up, and he used to find learning the weekly Bible verse incredibly stressful. It was so hard seeing him trying to remember it at the start of each lesson. and that is such a barrier for people. And unnecessary, because as long as you understand the meaning of the quote, you don't need to get it exactly right word for word. So where others could not only remember most of what was discussed, but also quote scripture in their arguments, which makes you feel like an outsider. So if you think about the stress we put on people to be good Bible students, to know verses for each belief that we have, it can be overwhelming and not in any way inclusive. One of our two sons exhibited what we eventually had confirmed as dyslexia. But even before that mid-teen diagnosis, we found ourselves up against the normal expectations of life as a Christadelphian family. We tried to do Bible readings together as a family, but this proved entirely counterproductive to a positive experience. But it was when visiting other ecclesias with the family that we had our most difficult experience. I made a point of arriving early at one meeting to ask the Sunday school teacher that my son not be asked to read in the class. I reassured my son and he agreed to go into Sunday school with that promise. After the meeting, he was clearly very upset and told us he'd been made to read from his Bible, had struggled with it and was laughed at by the others in the class. He was inconsolable and angry. Our son dropped out of church as soon as he could at 17. He said then that it wasn't for him. Years later, he still feels that he could not fulfil the expectations placed on members, brothers especially. So we can see that although it feels like when we first think about dyslexia, we might think in this day and age, it's not that much of a problem. We can access audiobooks, we can listen to podcasts, we can watch videos. And that is true for our generation growing up now, our children. I hope that it's a much more positive environment for dyslexic people in our Sunday schools. But it's important to remember we still have many adults in our community, many of whom may not have been diagnosed with dyslexia, who are carrying this around, this sense of shame, of not fitting in, not wanting to be part of a community that puts so much emphasis on reading. So, how do we support people with dyslexia? Here's some ideas. You may have some more, which we could maybe talk about later in the panel. Don't reinforce the ideal Christadelphian model. So as much as we can, we need to welcome other ways of learning, not expect everyone to be able to read in a group, be available for conversations. So I know that when people have struggled with faith in the past, the immediate Christadelphian response is, "Oh, have you read this book?" And that's not necessarily going to be the right response. It might be, "Oh, I read this book which really helped me. Would you like to chat to me about it sometime over coffee?" That would be a much more supportive way to help someone with dyslexia. Use a variety of learning methods. Now, we tend to automatically do this for children, but not so much with adults. And that's what I want to stress really, that a variety of learning methods is important for adults as well as children. And we're going to look at a few of those on the next slide. Obviously now there's lots of Bible apps, there's audiobooks, there's AI. So for example, you can import a PDF into AI and ask it to play you a podcast of two people discussing the PDF. It's amazing. I know AI has its drawbacks as well, but there's lots of options out there that we can use now. Another thing to think about is that we use written communication a fair amount. We use slides, we have notes from business meetings, we have emails generally. So we just need to try and keep those concise. If we can use a pastel background, that reduces visual noise. Dyslexia-friendly fonts, so any font without the serif on is usually good. There's quite a few specialist fonts out there as well, and I've put those on the handout. So, thinking about different ways of learning then, taking ourselves away from the idea that reading is the best way to learn or the ideal way to learn, and that other ways of learning are a bit inferior perhaps. Here's a few different ways of learning in Scripture that are equally as valid. Because, of course, thinking about Bible times, no one actually had a physical copy of the Bible who lived in Bible times. And they tended to read, if they were reading, they would read out loud to each other and discuss. It wasn't a case of just sitting and reading silently to themselves. So here are some different ways of learning that you could find in Scripture.
Public reading. Speeches. So far feels fairly normal. Public debate. Discussion in small groups. Writing. So the kings were asked to write down the law so that they would learn it. Proverbs. Over 40% of the Bible is stories, which of course, once you've learnt them, you can think about them anytime during the day. Poetry and songs. About a third of the Bible is poetry and songs, which would have been sung just as a normal part of daily life and memorised. Pictorial and metaphorical language, so using everyday objects such as bread, fruit, coins. You can think of all the parables. Sense, sensations, tastes, and touch. So thinking about more embodied learning now. Miracles, experiences, relationships, fellowship. Study of the natural world, from ants to stars. Reenactment, like the Feast of the Passover, for example. Building, embroidery, and crafts. So, for example, the building of the tabernacle. Drama, visions, visual aids, and props, such as the prophets. So, thinking about all of that, if we can sort of remember that when we're in our churches and kind of spread that awareness that there are many, many other ways to learn about God, and to remember we're not always going to be able to help people by telling them the best book to read on a particular topic. So I'm actually running to time. This is amazing. We've got to break time. So in this longer break time, where hopefully you will be able to get a cup of tea or coffee and have time to drink it, if you don't struggle with sensory overwhelm, you could think about what's hitting your senses right now and imagine all of those inputs amplified, all the noises of the crockery and people talking and the different smells, all the different experiences that might be happening, all the chaotic moving about of people, and just imagine what that's like, and that will hopefully prepare us for our next session on ADHD. Okay, so we are here. Only 2 more sessions. ADHD then. Again, these figures are probably incredibly low, and in reality, it's going to be much higher than this. But ADHD affects a minimum of 3% of the population. It is quite a terrible name for the condition because none of the words actually really apply. So it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder. But as I said earlier, ADHDers can hyperfocus if it's something that is very interesting to them, or if there's a lot of urgency in the situation, like a deadline the next day, then they can focus on the assignment that they've had assigned to them 6 months ago, because then they can hyperfocus. So it's not really a case of attention deficit, but more a difficulty in regulating attention on demand. ADHDers tend to say, we can't control what we put our attention on. Doesn't feel like it's up to us. Our brain has just decided this is what you're going to do right now. And about a quarter have what's called inattentive ADHD, or sometimes it's called ADD, so the hyperactive bit has been taken out, which means they're not outwardly hyperactive. So one of my children has this diagnosis. They were hyperactive when they were younger, but as they've grown up, it's become internalized. So all the chaotic stuff is happening inside and isn't really obvious to anyone watching them. And people also object, which is reasonable, to the disorder bit at the end. ADHDers can grow up feeling broken, but most agree this is more due to the demands and stresses of modern life. And they, in fact, have very useful and important skills due to their ADHD, which do contribute significantly to society. So without those disordered ADHDers, the world would be a very different place. So as we did with dyslexia, we're going to go through some common strengths and then some common struggles that are on the flip side of some of those strengths. So ADHDers tend to have excellent emotional intuition. They can feel the vibe in the room and pick up on any awkward things happening between people very quickly indeed. But they also tend to feel emotions very deeply themselves. But that also can contribute to what's called rejection sensitivity, and also quite exaggerated mood swings as well. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria is what it's sometimes called. That's taking personally or in an extreme way rejection or even just slight negative comments and making them feel like it's the end of the world. So that's rejection sensitivity. What can also happen is that ADHD will very accurately pick up on the mood of the person with them, but then might assume that the mood is down to them, that it's their fault if the person is feeling angry or upset. So they kind of attribute all the blame to themselves. They suck up all the blame in the room and think it's because of something that they've done. And I'm not sure whether that's because of all the negative experiences they've had growing up or whether that's just a natural part of the condition. ADHDers are very quick thinking. They are excellent in a crisis situation or in performance situations. So they make great musicians, great emergency responders, because they are calm in a crisis. But that often means that ordinary everyday life just feels too slow. It's not going at the pace they want. One of my children, if the teacher is talking too slowly, they cannot take in the information. It's just too boring. And boredom actually feels painful for an ADHD. They did some research which shows that the same receptors for pain light up when an ADHD is bored. So boredom feels like pain to them. So there's often an inner restlessness and impulsivity, and that's why an ADHD will fidget with things and need something to occupy part of their brain or part all their hands while they're trying to learn something or while they're trying to sit. ADHDers are highly creative. They thrive on novelty, activity, and multitasking. So they love a dynamic environment. But this can often mean they end up, like dyslexic people often do, with executive dysfunction. They are drowning in all the things that they want to do. They've started so many projects and not been able to finish them. Their house is littered with all these unfinished little things that they wanted to do, or even big things. And they bought all the equipment, they got all the dopamine from buying all the equipment for their new hobby. And then when they actually got around to starting it, the dopamine's gone. The dopamine came in with the planning, not with the actual doing. So this can be a very overwhelming way to live.
ADHD is taking a lot of information from the environment. They have no choice about this. It just comes in, and that can be overwhelming as well as useful. So this can lead to sensory overwhelm and burnout. And like I said, they take on the social anxiety and the shame from all the negative comments they've had growing up. And if anything negative happens in a situation, they will tend to blame themselves, which is, as you can imagine, a very difficult way to live.
So ADHD is not just trouble focusing and fidgeting. In fact, for my eldest, it looks just like trouble focusing. You don't even see the fidgeting really. It's all very subtle. But under the surface is a whole swathe of things that come along with ADHD. I'm not going to read all of these out now, but you can see there's a lot of them. Some of them to do with mental health. So often depression can come along with ADHD. Financial problems, because partly because the ADHD mind has a kind of out of sight, out of mind thing going on. So money doesn't feel real because it's just all digital, and it's on the app that they're not looking at. So they'll overspend because they're feeling impulsive and they don't realise they're overspending. They're not adding it up in their head, and suddenly all the money's gone. And also, of course, they want to keep changing jobs because they do a job for a few months and then they think, oh, I'm getting bored of this, I need to do something new. So it's very difficult to kind of settle into any kind of consistent career or consistent income, or it can be. And of course, it's just losing items, forgetfulness, unable to decide what to do because there's so many things you want to do, you don't know where to start. Sensory overwhelm's a big thing. Forgetting to look after yourself, or not noticing your own body signals. So not noticing that you've just focused on something for hours and you forgot to go to the toilet, you forgot to eat, and then suddenly it all hits you and it's overwhelming. And then you're too hungry to make the food that you need to keep yourself going. All of these things are just constantly happening all the time. You can't switch it off. Thinking about the executive function branch of ADHD then. So we looked at this a little bit with dyslexia as well. This chart is based on figures. It's kind of a rule of thumb from a researcher called Dr. Russell Barkley, who's an ADHD specialist. He says the ADHD brain is on average around 30% behind its peers in terms of executive age. So in terms of being able to manage your impulse control, control your own attention, your working memory, and your reasoning. So all of the things that help you access what you know. So if we think about that in terms of what we expect of people, this is to do with the frontal lobe, which controls regulation. So it's the boss, the voice in your brain, the executive assistant that tells you what to do with what you know. And so this part is behind schedule with ADHDers. So although they might know the information, they might not be able to access it quickly enough. So they might know that the stove is hot, but still impulsively touch the stove because the part of their brain that tells them not to has not come online in time. So it's not that they don't know the information, it's just they can't access it quickly enough. So this can be incredibly frustrating for the people around them, and it's frustrating for themselves as well. So if you think about a child age 9, we would expect them to be relatively controlled in the kitchen, to not be silly with the knives, to remember not to touch the hot things. The 9-year-old with ADHD knows all that stuff, but may still end up impulsively doing the wrong thing and hurting themselves in the process. So if we look at all these ages, we do that rule of thumb, 30% behind peers. This keeps going because we know now, there's some recent research, the brain keeps developing in your 20s. So you're 10 years behind. By the time you reach 30, you're 10 years behind your peers in terms of being able to carry out a plan and go through all the steps and not impulsively do something that you regret later. It can be helped with medication. That can help to make up the difference. It's not to do with our inability to learn anything. It's not to do with intelligence. It is simply that an ADHD will be more emotionally reactive. They might be more impulsive, explosive, disorganized compared to other people their age. So if we think about in terms of behaviour, what that might mean well, it does mean more people in prison have ADHD, for example. You might end up with teenage pregnancies because of impulsive behaviour. It still happens. It has a massive impact on people's lives, and that those impacts will keep spinning out as people continue to get older. So a quote from Ecclesial sister about ADHD. The challenges that we have faced as a family are probably summed up in the stigma of ADHD. The assumption of children with ADHD being naughty or a handful or lazy or forgetful. A bit of a byword for unacceptable and something that you want to hide. So therefore, you have to work to change that. You can't hide it and you have to explain it. And that means filling in consent forms for youth weekends with 2 paragraphs of information about how they might need a gentle reminder to move from one activity to another, or of instructions, or that they might doodle in the lovely notebook that you gave them rather than take note. Because you are worried that people will see the label ADHD and have an idea in their mind of what that means, which won't necessarily be right. Masking and overwhelm. So ADHDers and autistics will often what we call mask their behaviour. They will try and not necessarily consciously, but they've learned to keep themselves safe, that they hide various parts of their struggles when they're around other people. It might be because they've experienced bullying. It might be because they've been told not to. So, for example, I remember being told not to put your hands over your ears if people are being noisy, because that's rude. So for years I suffered noisy environments, thinking, well, I can't put my hands over my ears because that's rude, but this is overwhelming for me. What am I going to do? That's a form of masking. And if we do that with lots of things that we struggle with during the day, that can become exhausting, because you are constantly filtering yourself. If we think about ADHDers with their impulsivity, they're constantly filtering they're trying to filter what comes out their mouth, because often what comes out their mouth, they think, oh, shouldn't have said that. And they regret it instantly, but it's already gone, it's already out. And then they'll feel awful about it. So it is extremely tiring. And then the overwhelm from the sensory side of things as well is extremely tiring. So what you can end up with is meltdown and shutdown. So meltdown is the outward expression of the tiredness. So that can be explosive behaviour, such as shouting, crying, throwing things, running away. Things that look like, in children, you might assume are a tantrum. A child is doing this on purpose to get their own way because somebody said no. But it could actually be a meltdown, which they have no control over. And when it's over, they will be absolutely exhausted. It might manifest as shutdown. So that's what happens more in our family, which is more inward. It could look like they've zoned out, they can't speak, they can't move, they've just got stuck and they're not even aware that somebody's talking to them. And both of these can lead to exhaustion. And eventually, if you don't get the rest you need, it can lead to burnout. A lot of neurodivergent people live with pretty much constant burnout, where they need to rest at the end of each day, at the end of each week. They just need downtime when nothing's required of them. They can just maybe look at a screen or just be on their own, and then they can get on and they can cope with the next day. But you can end up with a kind of accumulated burnout, which builds and builds and builds, where perhaps you're feeling the pressure of the demands of school or work, and you just can't relax. So even when you do get the downtime, you're not actually recovering. And this happened with one of our children with school, ended up with long-term burnout, and they had to be taken out of school for a whole year to recover, without the feeling that they needed to get back to school, because just thinking they needed to get better to get back to school was enough to keep them in that state of burnout. So sometimes it can take a long recovery time, but there's really nothing else to do but to just rest and reduce the demands. So a comment here about that. Being a parent of autistic and ADHD children has made me reassess and prioritise all the normal expectations of church and society in general. We can't live up to it all, and some expectations would have such a negative impact on our children's view of church and on their health. So, what is really important for them to learn? What do I stand my ground on, and what do I let go of, so that we all have the energy to focus on the right things? It is difficult to explain to people why we can't manage everything. So, ideas to support. The practical things. These are the things that people tend to find easier to do. But there are other things that we can think about as well. in terms of just generally reducing demands on people and not expecting them to be able to do the full programme of things that other people would do. But the practical things for sensory issues that churches can do, you can provide spare ear defenders or noise cancelling headphones. You can provide spare fidgets, a quiet room if possible. We use acoustic panels at our church to divide the Sunday school classes to that kind of reduce the overwhelm of the noise, and non-fluorescent lighting if possible, because that can be overwhelming too. So other ideas which are harder to do but are probably more important, to be flexible, to allow for inconsistency in yourself and in others. Incorporate movement breaks and brain breaks and changes of activity. Teach using a variety of methods and give alternative options for responses. So don't necessarily ask people to fill in a sheet, for example. Give different options. I used to love our Sunday school teacher used to say at the end, what would you like to do for your homework this week? And we would have a choice and we could pick what we wanted to do. And if we didn't manage to do it, it wasn't the end of the world. Informal social time is important, so that people can talk through what they're going through. And if we can, be open about our own struggles when we feel comfortable, and that hopefully will encourage others to feel that they can be open about theirs and maybe drop their mask a bit. So, slightly later than I was hoping, we'd come to the next short break. Oh no, actually we're completely on time. Isn't that good? Wow. Okay, so perhaps you could think about during this break what ways your church might be overwhelming and what practical steps you might be able to take to improve this. Okay, time to start our final session of the morning. We are here, look how far we've come. So our final session is on autism, which is the yellow sheets, if you've got the handouts with you. And a little bit at the end on ADHD. Sadly, I can't fit in a lot on that, but I will be mentioning it at the end. So again, very conservative figures. I anticipate the actual percentage is much higher than this, but according to figures currently available, autism affects at least 1 or 2% of the population. And to get a diagnosis, you usually have to show that you have deep special interests, issues with communication, such as speech and social cues, struggling with social cues, challenges adjusting to change or showing repetitive behaviour, and sensory sensitivity. So in that category, it has a lot in common with ADHD in terms of experiencing sensory overwhelm. So as with ADHD, masking is likely, which can lead to burnout. It's very important to notice that when we think about autistic spectrum, we can naturally end up thinking that it's a line that you are either not autistic or mildly autistic, or you're very autistic. But this isn't how it works. It's more like a wheel. So there are different aspects of autism, and every person will have the different segments of the wheel. They will experience different volumes of that, like sliders on an amp. And actually, people might experience different volumes of those different triangles, depending on the environment they're in, what kind of day they're having, what they're going through in their life at the moment. It's incredibly variable, which means that terms like high functioning and low functioning don't really work, because you may be high functioning one moment and low functioning the next. And also they can in themselves be quite insulting labels, because how do we define that? What do we really mean by functioning? So that's just something to be aware of. So common strengths and common struggles for people with autism. The common strengths are, because of our sensory sensitivity, we can gain a lot of joy from small things, which some people like to call glimmers. So on the struggle side, you might have triggers. On the strength side, you might experience a lot of glimmers in your everyday life from very simple things like your favorite blanket or your favorite song. You can feel an intense amount of joy from those things. And it can also lead to talent and gift in certain areas. So, for example, being sensitive to sound can lead to musical giftedness. The struggles, however, are that, of course, like as with ADHD, you end up with sensory overwhelm and burnout because everything is turned up to 11 that you're receiving. This is possibly also why autistic people have trouble interpreting their own body signals, because they are taking in such information from outside. They're often confused about their own internal body signals. So that's known as interoception, where you notice that you're hungry or you notice that you're feeling poorly. So one of my children, if they're feeling poorly, they've no idea what's wrong with them. They can't explain it. They can't even say whether it's a pain from the outside or a pain from the inside. They're just very, very confused by their own body signals. It can also make it difficult to interpret emotions as well. So that's alexithymia, where you don't really know how you're feeling, which can be difficult when you're, for example, in a therapy scenario, and the first question that comes out of the therapist's mouth is, how are you feeling today? An autistic person may not be able to say how they're feeling today. Common strengths: deep special interests, attention to detail, and what's called monotropic flow, where you're able to focus and you just enjoy the focus of your experience, your learning, whatever it is you're doing. You get completely absorbed in it. Nothing else can interfere with that flow, and that is an amazing feeling, and often ends up leading to a deep expertise in certain subjects or a deep expertise in skills, which is incredibly satisfying. But it can also mean that you can get a little bit restricted or obsessive in your interests, and that might not be what everybody wants to hear about. And you may end up neglecting yourself as well because you're so absorbed in what you're doing, or you may neglect your relationships because you're just focused so much on your interests, you forget to check how everybody else is in your family, for example. And you can really struggle with transitions and interruptions and unpredictability, particularly if you're in that monotropic flow state and you are so beautifully absorbed in what you're doing, and then you're asked to drop all of that and do something else. It can be very challenging. Autistic people are often very independent and content in their own company. I absolutely love being on my own. And tend to enjoy structured social time. So I love to attend something where I know what the activities are going to be. There's going to be things for us to do. If I'm invited to just a social situation where you're just having a meal or you're going out for coffee, that is more overwhelming for me. That's difficult. I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'm going to be able to think of things to say. It's all a bit unknown and murky, and I don't like that. And autistic people often find large groups overwhelming as well, for the sensory reasons and also just trying to keep track of different conversations. Autistic people are often very loyal friends who can be trusted, care deeply about honesty and about justice. So they will often, be great campaigners for change. They will stand up for things if they feel things are unfair. And so they're the real sort of movers and shakers in society. They can really make people change how things are done, which is fantastic. On the flip side, they might be seen as disruptive or rude or too honest, which can obviously hurt people's feelings. And then if they realise they've done that, that can lead to sort of intense shame and embarrassment, and never doing whatever it was ever again. Or trying not to. So that can be really difficult for people. Other things that are relevant to what we're considering in terms of church and faith I'll just mention as well, there's a few little extras. Autistic people might have difficulty with eating around other people. That might be because of their restrictive diet. They might just worry if they're going to show up to something, if there's going to be food that they like or they can eat there. But it is also the idea of being observed. Autistic people don't always like being watched, and they might get a bit worried about people seeing them eat. And also it's having to focus on more than one thing at once because you're eating and you're expected to talk to people. I would much rather do those things separately myself, just go away somewhere and eat on my own and then come out and talk to people afterwards. My dad used to go, when it was fraternals at his meeting, he always used to go home for beans on toast in the shared meal and then come back again for the session afterwards. So that can be quite awkward in terms of how we run our churches, because a lot of what we do is centered around eating together. PDA, which the medical term for this is pathological demand avoidance, but a lot of PDAs prefer the terms persistent drive for autonomy, which is a more positive way of framing it. It basically means you struggle if you feel like there's demand to do something, you instantly do not want to do it. And that's not necessarily if someone else is telling you to do something, although that's obviously the case. And it's not even if they are obviously in charge. Even subtle things like reward charts can make you not want to do the thing because you feel like you're being manipulated. There's a few reasons for this. Partly it's just the body's attempt to keep itself safe, because if we do experience things intensely, or we've had bad experiences in the past, then we're on alert in situations as to if someone's trying to get us to do something we don't feel safe doing. So it can make us very resistant to anything that feels like we're not in control. But it also affects us if we decide we want to do something. So if we, for example, buy a guitar because we really want to learn to play the guitar then sits there in the room staring at us, demanding to be played, and instantly we do not want to then do it. Situational mutism, which is sometimes called selective mutism, but I don't tend to like that term because it kind of infers that the person has a choice, that they've decided that they're not going to talk. But situational mutism is something I prefer to use. So we know that some autistic people are just always non-verbal and might use alternative communication devices. But a lot of autistic people can usually speak very clearly and articulately, but then in certain situations just find themselves suddenly unable to talk, which can understandably be quite alarming for them. Bottom-up processing style. So people tend to be either top-down thinkers or bottom-up thinkers. And a lot of autistic people are bottom-up thinkers. And what that means is that we see the details first. In fact, we can't look past the details to see the big picture necessarily. So we want to know all the information before making a decision. Small mistakes will bother us. They'll just throw us off. How can we trust anything that anybody's saying if there's a mistake here? Because they haven't checked it all properly. They haven't made sure there's no mistakes. So what if there's more mistakes that I've not spotted? It doesn't make us very popular because mistakes do tend to jump out. And I do have to kind of remember the praise sandwich formula. If someone shows me something that they've done, I have to remember, I've got to say that I'm really grateful to them for doing it, and isn't this particular thing is really good, but I've just spotted this little thing here, but thank you so much for doing it. That's the praise sandwich. Because otherwise I might just blurt out, oh no, we spelt resurrection wrong. It's just, it gets you into trouble. It also can affect you with faith issues, because if you imagine nowadays, if you even look into one aspect of your faith, like maybe evidence for the resurrection, that is now a bottomless topic. If you're looking online, you will never really get to feel like you've looked into it completely. You've not got to the end of assembling all the information together in order to reach your conclusion. And if you magnify that by all the different things that are building up your faith, that can be incredibly overwhelming, and you can feel like you can never be completely sure. And that can be quite a difficult aspect for autistic people to deal with. Literal thinking is another challenge as well. It can be a bit of a stereotype that we might think literally. Some people think that means we don't understand sarcasm and things like that, but it's not necessarily that. But we might sometimes struggle with metaphorical language. I do picture the metaphors in my head before I get to what they mean. So that can be quite off-putting in prayers when people are talking about several homes and beds of sickness and things like that. It can be very distracting. And also, if we think about, if we from the platform, people are saying things like, it's always important to give 100%. It's always important to be doing your best all the time. Autistic people could take that incredibly literally and end up burning themselves out because they think that giving 100% means you never rest, you never give yourself a break. And that can actually cause quite serious health problems. So those are some things to kind of be aware of. And another aspect of the literal thinking issue is developing a relationship with God and Jesus, who we don't actually see, and making our faith more literal in terms of how we relate to each other or what we can do to contribute to church or the community is a way of kind of helping support with that. Here's a quote from another Christadelphian. As parents of someone who has autism, we've always felt very apprehensive when going to a new Christadelphian event that we've not attended before, because we never know how our child will respond to the people, the building, the sounds, smells, the layout of the chairs, etc. We like to give as much information as possible beforehand, what's going to happen, who's likely to be there, etc. But there's still usually a lot of unknowns. It's hard for us to fully relax. It feels like we're on edge, looking out for potential triggers. So this can have a big impact on autistic people and their families. So ideas to support. Again, the same sensory ideas as we had for ADHD. Be flexible with our approach. Be careful with language. Autistic people tend to be sensitive to the pressure of duty and of living up to ideals. They can take this incredibly seriously, and it can cause despair or anxiety when this is unattainable. So when we're talking about how a disciple should live, it's really important to frame this with also the caveat that we are human beings who cannot always manage it. Allow time to process change, feelings, and new ideas. So if, for example, you are planning to change something about church, or you're planning to discuss something in your members' meeting, it's great to give people warning in advance so they have time to process, especially autistic people have time to think, how do I really feel about this? Rather than putting them on the spot in the moment when they might struggle to speak or they might struggle to really work out how they feel about something. Maybe it's best if they could think about it beforehand and maybe write it down and ask someone else to express it for them. To help things be more predictable, share running orders for events, give them an escape route, a way out. So when I started my presentation this morning, I said, please get up and leave if you need to. There's a quiet room to go to whenever you need it. If you're giving someone a lift somewhere, you can say, if you need to leave early, that's fine. I can take you home early. Knowing the escape route is there is often all an autistic person needs to be able to come. If they don't know that they've got that, that might be a barrier to them coming at all. And in contradiction to the ADHD social time, an autistic person will benefit from structured social time with smaller groups of people. So a board game night or something like that would be much more appealing than a Sunday school party, for example. But this is where we come to the tricky part, because if you have autism or if you have ADHD, you, roughly speaking, have a 50-50 chance that you also have the other one. And there's no real, there are some statistics on this, but of course they might not be accurate, because the problem is if you have both, one can often mask the other because they're quite contradictory. But more and more people are now being diagnosed with both. So 3 out of 5 members of our family have been diagnosed with both. and they're often diagnosed later in life because of the disguising effect of one against the other. And you can feel like you are two different people struggling to know how to please both. You can't please both at the same time. One side of you is always not happy. And this could be really disorienting and tricky to get to the bottom of. Until you have the diagnosis of both, it can be really hard to understand yourself, let alone have other people understand you. Because part of you will crave routine, part of you will want novelty. Part of you will want to plan, part of you will want to just be impulsive and spontaneous. Part of you really needs time alone to recover, but you also love to chat to people. You have favourite interests, but your interests shift. So you might have a very deep interest in something, but also a very deep interest in something else, and something else, and something else, and something else. You love familiar things, but you also love new experiences. You like to think ahead, but you're also very much in the moment. You're focused, but you're also a multitasker. You're a perfectionist, but you can't complete anything. You're logical, but you're also creative. And it's an exhausting place to be. And I'm afraid I don't have a lot of advice to offer on that, because we're running out of time, but also it is such a big topic and a very new one, because it was only recently that you could be diagnosed with both in a lot of circumstances. So just my greatest sympathy if you have both, but also you also have wonderful gifts, which I hope you're able to make the most of. So to conclude, I'd like to quote someone who was actually talking about ADHD, but I thought it was very appropriate for neurodiversity in general, and all neurodivergent conditions. So I thought this was a lovely quote to finish with. I think people understand that ADHD in girls and boys might present differently, but perhaps the understanding that ADHD presents differently in each individual is the most important thing that we can do. The best accommodations aren't necessarily the ones that accommodate for ADHD, they are the accommodations that allow for individuals. Understanding that not everyone will think the same way or want to do the same things, and that participation and engagement in all sorts of church activities can look different. Thankfully, this attitude is one that we have encountered more often than not. And I think that's certainly something that we're trying to do in our church is we don't expect everyone to come to everything, but we try to provide different activities that will help support different people. So we've recently started a monthly quiet service on a Sunday evening, which is hopefully has a lot less noise around it, a lot less distraction, and people can have a predictable time there, as opposed to our morning services, which have the families and all the busyness and activity and bustle that comes along with that. So that's just one example of how to approach neurodivergence, is to make sure you're thinking about people and their different needs and not expecting everyone to be able to do everything. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful.